My name is Paul Klug. I was recently diagnosed with stage 3 colorectal cancer. More specifically, just rectal cancer, I suppose. That's where the tumor is located. Um, I live in northern Michigan. I was raised in northern Michigan. I've lived in a few other areas in the country throughout my life, but ended up back here. This is where I met my wife, and we recently just had our first child, our son Gordon. He's 8 months old. This whole journey really started just over a year ago. I started having some strange symptoms, mostly like bowel related. So I was having like really frequent bowel movements, really like loose stools, really just, and it was just continuous. It wasn't like, when you're sick, might have that go on for a few days. And so I ended up having just like a routine physical with my family doctor that was in November. And I brought it up. I was like, hey, I'm having these symptoms. Uh, just wanted to put on your radar. He's like, let's keep an eye on it for a little bit and see what happens and get back with me. Um, so needless to say, like over the next couple months, it mainly stayed the same. I didn't really see any improvement. I wasn't prescribed anything. I wasn't taking any medication. We were just kind of seeing like, is this going to get better or not? His initial thought was it might just be some inflammation or something, maybe change in diet, although I had told him like my diet hadn't really changed, but that's kind of the first thing people will say when you start having these types of symptoms. Um, so basically, like the symptoms didn't improve, and I got back to them and he referred me to a gastroenterologist. And I had an initial consult with a gastroenterologist, and he kind of said a little bit of the same thing, where it's like, all right, you've got these strange symptoms going on. Let's just monitor it for a few weeks, maybe a month, and see where things end up. Well, during that time, the symptoms changed from being like frequent bowel movements and loose stools to I started noticing some like blood spotting in my stool. And that's where I got pretty concerned. So I called him and he was like, okay, yeah, we definitely need to get you in for a colonoscopy. And so like the colonoscopy was just a few weeks after that. And that is when they discovered that I have a pretty good sized tumor down there that was the root cause for these symptoms. What kind of like pushed me to advocate for myself more was actually my wife. She really was like, this is not right. Like something's going on here. Like you need to get this checked out. And just taking one step back, I suppose you had mentioned like doctors, maybe this isn't on their radar. I'm so young and healthy, this, that, whatever. And some other things that were thrown around early on was, like ulcerative colitis, diverticulitis, even Crohn's disease, all those things have very parallel symptoms to what I was experiencing. And from an age perspective and like a existing conditions perspective, those made a little more sense. So, but yeah, really, my wife was the one who was like, hey, like you really need to put your foot in the ground and like say like, I don't believe that that's what this is. This is something else. This is something more. And it was really at her stern recommendation that I got back in touch with the gastroenterologist to get the actual colonoscopy because that's kind of in the back of my mind. It's something just felt wrong, and I had known generally of the fact that these types of cancers were increasing in prevalence, and it was always kind of in the back of my mind as I had been experiencing these symptoms. And obviously, no one wants to think like, "Ah, I think I have cancer," but it felt like somehow, some way, I just intuitively had this feeling that there was something like that going on, and that this wasn't just, a bout of colitis or something like that. I had a feeling that it was something more. And yeah, it took some encouragement from my wife to get me over the edge to really advocate for myself there. The whole colonoscopy experience is pretty straightforward. I mean, I had it done at a surgery center. I'm pretty sure all colonoscopies are done in an outpatient manner, whether it's at a hospital or a surgery center. It's normally a pretty quick in and out. The prep is the worst part. Uh, you basically drink laxative for 24 hours before the colonoscopy. Uh, Somehow, some way, they have not figured out a way to make it taste good yet, despite all of the advances that we have in the medical field. It still tastes just like a super salty lemon Gatorade. Um, not a fun experience. But once you get through the prep, the colonoscopy itself is pretty short. I think it's only about a half hour. They put you under for it. And so I got to the surgery center. Um, they tapped. the IV, went back for the procedure. Um, in my mind, I was just ready to get some conclusiveness for these symptoms that I had had going on. And yeah, when I came to, asked my wife like if I had cancer. Sure enough, I could tell by her reaction that they had found something that looked suspicious. When the doctor came in, they had some images of the actual tumor, and obviously, in a colonoscopy, the gastroenterologist will not actually make the diagnosis because they have to biopsy the tumor, and there are a number of other tests that go into determining if it is actually malignant and what the staging is. So, in their very like legally correct terms, he was like, "Hey, so." We found this mass. It's consistent with what we identify as colorectal malignancies, which means cancer. Um, and, you know, basically explained that this was a pretty significant size tumor and that it was likely that it had breached a couple layers of the rectal wall, which is a key factor for staging colon cancer as well, and showed me the pictures. Looked pretty gnarly. Definitely looked like cancer. I don't know what most people envision cancerous tumors to look like, but this thing was, it just looked like evil, I guess. It wasn't like nice and symmetrical and rounded. It definitely didn't look like, typical tissue that you would have in your body. Um, and so after and so he explained that they took a couple of tissue samples from various spots on the tumor to have it biopsied. The biopsy results came back pretty quickly, confirmed that it was in fact cancer. And so at that point, we kind of had half of the diagnosis where it was, yes, you have cancer, but we still need to determine the staging. The staging is not determined through the colonoscopy. That's really the first step in kicking that process off. It really felt like I was kind of living in a fever dream, like I hadn't actually woken up from having the colonoscopy yet, and that this was just something that it felt like a bad dream. Like that's like the only way I can explain it. Like I had my colonoscopy on a Friday. It was Friday afternoon. So not a great time to have a colonoscopy because there's no other testing that's going to get done over the weekend or anything like that. So I basically had the weekend to sit on this news that I had cancer and likely a pretty advanced cancer. Um, and yeah, I remember, uh, my wife and I left the surgery center, definitely shed some tears in the car in the parking lot because like at that point we had no idea, like, is this gonna kill me? Is this, where else is it? Like, oh, this is a big, like, all we knew is that it was a a pretty mature tumor, and it wasn't small, it wasn't tiny, and so it was at that point, anything was on the table. This could have been anywhere else in my body. It was, needless to say, very shocking, and also very emotionally jarring. We, like you said, we were kind of riding this high of just having our first kid, and we had just recently bought our first house, and everything kind of seemed to be going according to plan in our life. And we had just gotten back from Italy. One of my best friends was had gotten married in Italy, so it was like this amazing vacation that we were on. And then 5 days later, uh, we got grounded back to earth pretty quickly. And yeah, I mean, that weekend was the longest 3 days of my life. Like I didn't sleep very much. My wife didn't sleep very much. We spent a lot of time just talking about how we're going to get through this, even though we don't know exactly what the situation is. We don't know exactly what's going on. Um, but irregardless, we're going to fight it. We're going to do everything we can to get through it. But yeah, there was a lot going through my head in those few days afterwards because there were so many uncertainties and really so few answers at the time. So it was definitely, um, a really, really tough time. I'll never forget how I don't think I've ever felt more out of control in my own life as I did in those few days following that colonoscopy, because it was uh, the middle of the next week before I was able to really get any further answers on what's going on. So, um, but yeah, that waiting period is definitely the longest amount of time that anybody who receives this type of diagnosis is going to experience. What happened next is my first conversation that took place after. this kind of initial discovery and the biopsy results came back was with a nurse navigator for the colorectal surgeon. And so she reached out and kind of laid out, how things are going to work as far as determining the staging goes. So for me, uh, or for anybody, when you get that type of diagnosis or you're showing certain symptoms, they're going to want to stage the cancer and get an understanding of really what's going on. So for me, that consisted of, if I remember correctly, three different tests or exams. So the first was a blood test that came back clean. The next thing they did was a CT scan, and so this was kind of the most anxiety-inducing part of the staging process because this is where they figure out is this bad or not. I mean, not that it's not bad, but just being in the rectum, but obviously if it's other places, it's a significantly more tricky situation. So yeah, I definitely had some major nerves going into the CT scan, and the CT scans are super quick and super easy. It takes just a few minutes, and it was with and without contrast in my abdomen and my chest. And very fortunately for me, that came back uh, clean, with the exception of the original tumor that was found. So there was no spreading to my lungs or to my liver, which is where colon cancer typically spreads first because of the shared blood supply. There was no signs of tumors of any size in my lungs or liver, and the only spreading that they found, which led to the stage 3 diagnosis, was in two lymph nodes directly adjacent to the original tumor. So that was uncovered from the CT scan, and so that knowing that the cancer is regional to that rectal area, then the next step was an MRI, and this basically gives the surgeon, the oncologist, and the radiation oncologist a crystal clear picture of where the tumor actually is, what the level of penetration is through that rectal wall, and then kind of a more clear picture around the lymph nodes. So that basically just confirmed uh, the the stage 3 diagnosis, um, gave some really specific parameters around the starting size of the tumor, where it's located within your rectum, which is really important for the surgeon to know as they're planning for the resection surgery if that's going to be needed. The next step after all that information is compiled is the surgeon, the oncologist, the radiation oncologist, they all get together with a group of other oncologists and their peers for a tumor board, is what they call it. And they will kind of evaluate all this information, compare it to similar cases, compare it to other cases they've worked, compare it to peer-reviewed studies, all kinds of information. There's a very large, basically, playbook of ways that they go about treating cancers that meet certain criterias. Um, so the next step was I met with my oncologist, and he kind of explained that to me. For my case in particular, everything was relatively the middle of the road. And when I say everything, I mean um, when they biopsy the tumors, they're looking for a little bit more than just is this cancer or not. They're looking for uh, anatomical and physiological characteristics of the tissue so that they can determine what type of chemotherapy is going to be most appropriate. So I didn't know this, but I know this now. There are lots of different combinations of chemotherapy drugs that can be given to treat cancers. It is not a one size fits all. So the first thing they're looking at is what type of tissue is this and basically what's going to kill it. And so that determines partially what type of chemo you're going to get and what type of chemo regimen you're going to get. So for me, that was Capox, which is one of two very common treatment regimens for colorectal cancer. The other is Folfox, um, which basically means there's two different chemo drugs, one administered through an IV and one that I take orally. So chemo was going to be a part of it, and then he also explained that radiation and chemo in tandem are going to be a component, with the idea being that they want to basically push the cancer out of those lymph nodes and see if they can get the tumor or the cancerous tissue to recede a little bit through that rectal wall. They want to make the tumor as small as possible, basically, before they go in and do the surgery. So then um, assuming that the chemo and the radiation doesn't kill the cancer altogether, which the number they gave me for the probability of that might happen is about 25%. So there's a 25% chance that the cancer might be eradicated altogether without surgery, but they're planning for the surgery to happen, obviously, because it's more probable. So the chemotherapy um, will reduce the size of the tumor. The radiation also will reduce the size of the tumor and assist in potentially eradicating the tumor altogether. And then the next step would be the colon resection surgery. The original order that that was supposed to go in for me was going to be radiation and then chemo and then the surgery. They ended up switching the chemo and the radiation. The reason being they wanted to reduce the probability that I would develop scar tissue in the surrounding areas before going in for the surgery. Um, a potential side effect, and to my understanding, a pretty probable side effect of radiation is the development of scar tissue over time. And so they wanted to basically move the radiation closer to the surgery so that basically you do the radiation and then get right into the surgery. And that would lessen the probability that scar tissue would interfere with the actual resection surgery. So might develop scar tissue eventually, but it would ideally be after that surgery takes place so that they're not having to deal with the more rigid fibrous tissue that can occur with with the scarring. They ended up doing chemo, 5 rounds, 5 3-week rounds. So at this point in time, this is actually the final day of my fourth round. And then I'll have a short break of, I believe, a few weeks before getting into radiation. Radiation will be 6 weeks, and that's 5 days a week for 6 weeks. You go in every day for the radiation treatment, and I'll also be taking capecitabine, the oral chemo drug, twice a day during that time. And then, depending on how things are looking, assuming that there is still a small tumor there, uh, then the colon resection surgery would be next, pretty close in latency after the radiation finishes up. I'm definitely gonna get through this and become, a stronger and more contributing person to society through this experience because this is very difficult. And I know people that have had cancer. Unfortunately, I know people that have had colorectal cancer and not been able to defeat it. And, I told myself, I'm like, look, like I'm not the only person that I know that has had this type of diagnosis at this age, and something's got to be done about it. And once again, where most of the good ideas come from in our household, it was actually my wife's idea. And she was like, hey, you know what you should do? Because we were talking about that, and I was like, this just drives me crazy. Like I have this disease, and I know people that have had this disease, and I know people that have passed away with this disease, and like this is happening, and people just they don't associate cancers with being young. And she was like, well, why don't you make a TikTok and talk about it on TikTok? I got some really good response to some of my videos on TikTok. I've got a handful that have several 100,000 views talking about symptoms and signs and things to look out for. And to me, like, that's a success because that's a couple 100,000 people more that know a little bit about cancer that they might not have known before. And especially on the signs and symptoms and for younger people, seeing somebody like me who looks like them and talks like them and acts like them and saying, oh man, like that, if that guy can get it, I can probably get it too. And that's really where I started, was with this TikTok account. And I've been doing that for a few months. And I've had good feedback, good response, and I've actually kind of enjoyed it. So good call by my wife once again. For any men or married men watching this, definitely listen to your wives every step of the way. They will give you good ideas, and they will help you get the most out of what is otherwise a very interesting and oftentimes very negative experience. So anyways, um, so it started with a TikTok, and then I also started thinking of ways, I'm like, what were some things through this experience that were surprising to me? One thing that was surprising to me was the cost of the colonoscopy. So this is kind of my main uh, driver as far as what I'm trying to do with the nonprofit that I'm starting is, insurance companies are very complex, and insurance coverages are also very complex. However, in most cases, if you're my age and it's recommended that you get a colonoscopy, regardless of what your symptoms or signs are, most insurance companies will not cover that full cost if you're under the age of 45, regardless of what your doctor says or what your gastroenterologist says. They're not going to cover that full cost. And so I ended up paying a few $1,000s out of pocket to get it done. Um, and for some people, that cost is a direct barrier to why they will not get it done. And it's a direct inhibitor as to why people will push off having the procedure, or they'll meet with the GI and talk about their symptoms. And then maybe the GI will say, hey, the next step is a colonoscopy, and here's what it's going to cost. And people see that and they're like, I'm just not going to do that now, or I'm going to do it next year, or I'm going to do it in 2 years, or, I'm only 28. I'm going to worry about this when I'm 30. And that time period, that can make a huge difference. Like if I had waited 3 to 5 more years, I might not be here talking to you right now. And to me, that was kind of that's something that really kind of lit a fire in me as I was working my way through the treatment and looking back on the summer and saying, what this is crazy to me. Like there has to be something that can be done about this. So in addition to spreading general awareness through TikTok or through this and getting the word out there and talking to people and talking to my friends. I mean, that's another thing I've done is just talk to my friends. Hey, go get a colonoscopy. What are you talking about? I'm 29. I don't care, man. Go get it done. People growing up, I've always associated cancers with being kind of, an old person thing. Oh yeah, you might get cancer when you're old, when you're 60 plus. A lot of people, my grandparents, my grandma's fought breast cancer. Um, everybody, I feel everybody at this point knows somebody who's had a cancer bout of some form, and odds are they've been 50 or older. Not necessarily, but that's what most people in my generation associate, or our generations associate cancers. That's where they think that they show up. But nowadays, that is definitely not the case, and cases are exploding in younger people. Go out of your way to learn common signs and symptoms for common forms of cancer. It takes just a few minutes. It doesn't take that much time to do just a little bit of research. I mean, 5 minutes one time can save your life or can change your life. And especially those of us that are on our phones all day every day doing all kinds of stuff. Watch a TikTok, watch a reel, learn something about it, make yourself familiar, make yourself aware, and just educate yourself on the different ways that cancer can manifest. Because like I said, like it's never been more probable that cancers are that they're happening in younger people. And just take a little bit of time out of your day to make yourself familiar and understand um, what that can look like for any given person. If you have those signs and symptoms, do not be like me. Do not push it off. Do not make it so that your wife is being the one to push the issue with you. Be your own advocate and go to those yearly physicals, um, and talk to your doctors and have open conversations. Because a lot of people, I was like this. I went several years without a physical before I had this diagnosed, because I'm young, healthy, figured there's nothing wrong. I work out almost every day. I eat well. Why do I need to go have a physical? This is why you need to have the dialogue with your doctor, and you need to be an advocate for your own health, because nobody else can do that for you.